Tēnā koutou I tēnei pō, nā mi nui kia koto katoa. No mai, haere mai. E a ko rangatira, kia tātou e tōne, ka nui tako mihi. Te huti mai ki te tātou, hui whakanui. Ka nui te hanori ki te mihi kia koto, tēnei te mihi a te Herenga Waka kia koto. Ko Jennifer Windsor tāku inua, he toi arapai. A very warm welcome to everyone. I'm Jennifer Windsor, as Pinay said. I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor of Education, Humanities and Social Sciences here at Victoria University of Wellington. And before I go on, if you will please forgive me, I have put my wrong contacts in tonight. So I have a couple of notes in front of me, but it's almost impossible for me to see them. So fortunately, we have such a great event tonight that I don't think I really need notes, but I will do a little bit of ad-libbing. So it really is just a pleasure to join you all here tonight for the Wellington Faculty of Education's second annual lecture. It's especially good to be able to welcome so many of you here in this room. It's been a very difficult year, and this is one of the few events that the university has been able to hold in person. So thank you for being here. That sense of community means a lot to us. You'll also notice a little camera in the back of the room, which means that we are able to take advantage of some relatively newer technologies. And so a very warm welcome to everybody who is also joining us online. It's been one of the unexpected advantages of the pandemic that we've embraced some newer technologies. Now, we believe that the Faculty of Education has a decisive role to play, not only within the university in terms of advancing scholarship and research, but that it's as important that the faculty play a contributing role in the nation around translating that research into practice. And that has to do also with setting up the world for the future generation. That's all we have. So I really think that the research and practice that takes place in the faculty has a really important role to play in shaping policy, both in New Zealand and internationally. And that policy extends to areas around mathematics, literacy, around different qualifications, around early childhood education. So we're delighted to be able to come together tonight to hear from two speakers who are experts in a particular area of education's research and scholarship, and where they're delivering change for a particular group of learners. So tonight's speakers, Professor Jeff Sigafoos and Dr. Hannah Waddington, are two of our educational psychology experts, and they focus on the really pivotal and important to understand members of our community. They focus on autism spectrum disorders. And their research aims to bridge the gaps between research and practice. And in their case, I believe this work makes an important difference to the academic, the social, the economic, the career, the cultural lives of many people in New Zealand. I think they're at the very top of their game, and I'm really interested in hearing about the contributions that you're going to talk about tonight. Now, to introduce Hannah and Jeff, it's my pleasure now to welcome Dean Stephen Dobson. Stephen's academic background lies in pedagogy, in assessment and learning, and alongside his role as Dean, he really truly has worked to maintain an active sense of community. He's got a deep appreciation of the impact of educational research on society, and he's really part of his role is a deep commitment to helping us all sustain and understand civic engagement as a form of well-being. Now, he initiated the idea of an annual lecture last year. As I said, this is the second annual lecture. And he's just been a champion at really bringing to the fore ways in which the university can engage. There's a phrase in te reo, me korero ki ora ai tatou. Let us all connect so that we can foster a sense of well-being. And I think that's the heart of what Stephen is doing in championing these lectures. So with my thanks, Nami, Dean Stephen Dobson.
Thank you, Pro Vice-Chancellor Jennifer Windsor. Well done without contact lenses. Tēnā koutou, I hui mai nei e tēnā pō. E aku rangatire he mi e mahai tēnei kia koutou. I hara mai I raro I te karawai manaki. Ki te tō tōko tēnei kōpapa. Nōko te honorei he whakatui, whakatiria, tēnei hui, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Stephen Dobson, the Dean of the Wellington Faculty of Education, and I'm delighted to be welcoming so many of you to our annual lecture 2020. I do hope you'll be able to join us afterwards for refreshments. I'm looking forward to meeting as many of you as possible. I'm deeply proud to be the Dean of this faculty, which has a strong commitment to supporting the very best educational policy and practice, both in New Zealand and, of course, internationally. Our scholars work at the cutting edge of educational research, from early childhood to higher education, and are well known in many fields. These academic pursuits, of course, noteworthy, but to my mind what makes this faculty special is the determination of our staff to make use of their expertise, even in times of COVID, to give back to their communities and make a real difference in the lives of others. The two speakers are good examples of this. Their research directly benefits the community. And as Jennifer has mentioned, we have Professor Jeff Sigafoos and Dr. Hannah Waddington. They'll demonstrate their dedication to the practical application of research in the field of education and early intervention for children with autism spectrum disorder. Professor Jeff Sigafoos has a long history in educational psychology, and his research focuses on teaching adaptive skills to people or persons with developmental and physical disabilities. He is a globally respected academic for his work in this field, and we'll begin our lecture with an overview of the learning and behavioural characteristics associated with autism. Dr. Hannah Waddington will then speak about recent research carried out by herself and her team on early intervention for young children with autism. Dr. Waddington, who is both a practicing educational psychologist and a lecturer teaching across all levels of our educational programs, has recently established the university's Autism Clinic with kind support from Autism New Zealand, the Autism Intervention Trust, the IHC Foundation and private philanthropy. The clinic combines research into best practice with early interventions with community outreach and offers a range of practical therapies and other services for children and families. Hannah will tell you about the clinic's vital work. Please welcome Jeff Sigafoos and Dr. Hannah Waddington.
Kia ora, hello. No mai harimai, welcome. I want to thank Pine for the opening and Professors Windsor and Dobson for their opening remarks. Our topic tonight is autism, and in particular I'm going to talk about education and early intervention for children with autism. You may or may not be surprised to learn that Victoria University of Wellington is a major center of research in the area of autism. In the School of Education, for example, we have several energetic young researchers in this area, Drs. Hannah Waddington, Anne-Marie Carnett, and Kelly Carrasco. One of these researchers is here tonight to talk about her specific program of research in early intervention, and that's Hannah Waddington. These researchers are developing new and more effective interventions to enhance the social, cognitive, and communicative functioning of children with autism and other types of neurodevelopmental conditions. So tonight we'll hear about Hannah's research in early intervention and also, as Stephen mentioned, her clinical initiatives that have started up recently in Petone. That's right. My role is simply to provide some historical context to tonight's lecture. And the reason I decided to do that is a few years ago I was asked to give a speech like this at Monash University in Melbourne. And I started talking about educational interventions for children with autism and the different types of procedures that research has shown to be effective for those children. And at the end of the lecture, it was about an hour lecture, and at the end of it, a person stood up in the back and said, "Excuse me, that was all very interesting, but what is autism?" So I realized I had kind of misread my audience, and I thought, I'm not going to do that tonight. I'm going to give some background and then let Hannah get into some more nitty-gritty research activities. So I'm going to try and do that by giving some historical background to the education of children with autism and related types of developmental disability, covering a few major developments that I've put on this little slide here. I'm going to start back in the 1940s. Let's go back to 1943 to be precise, 77 years ago. That is the year that the first formal description of autism was published. It was published by the handsome guy on the far left there, the top far left, Leo Kanner. And when I was preparing this slide, my daughter was looking over my shoulder and she said, "Who's that?" Because I had his picture up there. And I said, "Oh, that's Leo Kanner. He was actually the world's first child psychiatrist." And she peered over my shoulder, took a closer look, and said, "He doesn't look like a child to me." So I had to explain that, no, he's a psychiatrist and his interest was in helping children. I'm sure I didn't have to explain that to you. So in that year, Leo Kanner published a description of 11 children that appeared to have a unique set of symptoms, and specifically the children all had unusual ways of interacting socially, atypical ways of communicating. Their development of communication skills didn't seem to follow the typical pattern. They had unusual uses of speech, often very non-functional, and sometimes just repeating back what they had heard from others, a condition called echolalia. And they also engaged in a number of repetitive and ritualistic behaviors, or in Kanner's words, they appeared to show an almost obsessive insistence on the maintenance of sameness. Kanner thought he was onto something here. He thought and speculated that he may have discovered a new, unique syndrome, and he also speculated that it probably had a biological origin. And subsequent research from that tended to confirm his initial suspicions. And autism emerged as the term to describe what was and is now considered to be a distinct condition or a unique syndrome. This condition is characterized by a triad of impairments: impairment in social interaction, impairment of communication development and language usage, and the presence of various ritualistic and repetitive behaviors, such as stereotype movements, insistence on following rigid routines, and a narrow range of interests. So one young man I worked with, for example, was really interested in garden hoses. And he could give you a very lengthy description of the different types of garden hoses they were and their different uses and where you could buy them and how much they cost. And it was all very fascinating for about the first 3 hours. While Kanner speculated that autism probably had a biological basis, it was in the 40s and 50s and into the 60s unknown what the cause was, and that's still the case today. The data gathered since then strongly suggest it is a biological condition with a genetic basis, but the exact cause of it still does remain unknown. Now, supporting the view that it probably has a biological basis is the fact that about 25% of children with autism develop seizures, often in adolescence. About 30% of children with autism it's also associated with known genetic conditions such as Fragile X syndrome, Cornelia de Lange syndrome, and tuberous sclerosis. So there's a clear link to known genetic conditions. It's also the case that about 30% of children with autism appear to also have an intellectual disability, which would seem to indicate some type of underlying neurologically based learning problem. So what about education? Well, the 1960s is when education really kind of comes into the picture. And we see there on the bottom left Professor Ivar Oli Lovas, who is a professor of psychology at UCLA. He published what is probably the first systematic attempt showing that you could teach skills to children with autism. He and his colleagues in 1965 published a study in the journal Science showing that children with autism who initially came into their program of research without having any speech were able to learn to imitate the speech of others through a fairly structured and intensive teaching program. At the time, that was a major accomplishment. At that time, children with autism were generally considered to be fairly unresponsive to education, and that's one of the reasons why they were often excluded from receiving a public education. One of the really nice things about that study and subsequent work occurring at the same time was that it really initiated and inspired a lot of other people to start developing and researching effective ways of trying to teach children with autism. And by the 1980s, there was a good number of studies showing that you could teach a range of different skills to children with autism. A lot of resources started coming out, such as this book here that's in the middle of the slide at the top. Just an example of one of the resources that was available in the 1980s. By that time, researchers were reporting success in teaching a range of skills to children with autism. Effective instructional programs were developed for teaching social skills, communication skills, play skills, leisure skills, vocational skills, daily living skills, and self-care skills. At that time, in the 1980s, I was a student in educational psychology, doing a master's and then a PhD. I was certainly inspired by the research coming out of that type of educational research, and it's one of the reasons why I ended up pursuing a career in that area. During the time that I was learning about autism and teaching programs for children with autism, there was some content in the coursework we were doing about autism, and at the time we were told that, autism is a very rare, severely disabling condition, and it's lifelong. Yes, you could teach a number of different skills to children with autism using pretty intensive and structured teaching methods, provided that they were done by highly qualified specialist teachers. But even then, the gains were always going to be somewhat modest. I guess you could say by the end of the 1980s, there was modest optimism tempered by relatively low expectations for what could be achieved educationally for children with autism. Some might say that at the time, those expectations were realistic given the available evidence. But since the 1980s, the evidence has just been getting stronger and stronger, and interventions have been getting better and better. One of the things that really changed this modest optimism was another study published by our friend Mr. Lovas in 1987. In that year, Lovas reported on an experimental early intervention program based on psychological principles of learning, and also a continuing refinement of the teaching procedures that he had been working on since the mid-1960s. So it's an evolution of his approach combined with the best new available evidence of learning principles. It's worthwhile considering this study in some detail because it really changed the expectations for children with autism. The study provided intensive and highly structured intervention, 40 hours a week for about 2 years, to 19 children who had been diagnosed with autism. There were another 19 children who served as a control group, and those children received a similar program, but at a much less intense dosage, so to speak, 10 hours a week. At the conclusion of the study, the two groups showed strikingly different outcomes, greatly favoring the treatment group. The most astonishing finding was that 47% of the children who received the intervention, that is 9 out of the 19 children, no longer showed any symptoms of autism at the end of the intervention. The gains made by these 9 children were in fact so striking that they were considered to have achieved normal educational and intellectual functioning. These children were followed up 10 years later, and they were reported to be behaviorally indistinguishable from their same-age peers. What Lovas had shown was the potential of early intervention. The potential for early intervention to yield massive and lasting improvements in the children's social, communicative, educational, and cognitive functioning. The benefits of this type of early intervention program have since been replicated numerous times, and Dr. Waddington is going to talk more about early intervention efforts that represent a naturalistic refinement of the things that Lovas had pioneered. What I want to point out to you now is the graph on the bottom right of the slide. This slide shows data related to the number of children being identified with autism spectrum disorder over the past 20 years. What you can see here, you don't have to worry about the actual numbers, but what you can see here is a striking increase in the number of children being identified. It is, in fact, a huge increase. When I was a student in the 1980s, we learned that autism was a rare condition affecting approximately 1 in every 2,500 children. What these data in this graph show is that autism seems to be much more common and affects about 1 in 100 children. And in fact, some figures are putting it at more like 1 in 50. So you might look at that graph and get a bit disheartened and say, this is a huge increase in the number of children being identified with a serious condition that affects their learning and development and ability to interact socially. However, I look at it with some optimism. And the reason for that is that the reason for the increase appears to be due to better screening, better diagnostic practices, and more accurate diagnostic practices, and an increased awareness. So I look at this data and see it as a good thing, because if you can identify children earlier, you can provide them with early intervention. And the data for early intervention looks pretty good. And once they've had early intervention, it's going to make education easier, and there's also now really good, effective educational programs. So on that note, it's my pleasure now to yield to my colleague, Dr. Hannah Waddington. She's going to describe her current work in providing early intervention to children with autism, and also talk about the Victoria University of Wellington Autism.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for that excellent background and introduction to this research. Thank you, Pine, for the opening, and Professors Dobson and Winsor also for the introduction. So I thought I'd begin this lecture today with kind of reinforcing, I guess, what Jeff has been talking about, and just about a bit of a picture of what treatment for children with autism looks like on a worldwide level. I've recently been involved in a project funded by the Australian government looking at synthesising, so bringing together all of the existing research, looking at non-pharmacological, so non-drugs based treatments for children with autism under the age of 12. And so what we found in this synthesis, looking at existing reviews, was that there are multiple approaches, a variety of different approaches with different theoretical underpinnings, such as the LOVAS approach that Jeff was talking about, more developmental approaches that can be beneficial for improving a range of outcomes for children on the autism spectrum. I don't have time today to go into all of these approaches. What is important in relation to our lecture is that we know that these approaches exist, and that we can support children with their social communication, with their language, with their daily living skills, with a whole range of things. What was really striking when working on this review was that there was very, very little research conducted in New Zealand. So looking at these reviews, every single review contains studies conducted in the United States of America, which is what you would expect. Most contain studies from Australia and from Europe, but within these reviews, not all of them said the countries in which the studies were conducted, but there was literally one single study conducted within New Zealand. So that just really emphasises the importance of the research we're doing here at Victoria University, trying to look at, okay, so we know that there's some things that are effective on a worldwide scale. What approaches could be suited to our specific New Zealand context? So that's just a bit of an introduction to the lecture that I'll be doing today. The first half is a bit of a map or a picture of what services are available to our families based on survey research that we did, and then tied in with that, what families and whānau said that they wanted from their services. The second half, as has been indicated by several people already, will focus on the Victoria University of Wellington Autism Clinic, some of the research coming out of this clinic, and also where we're going in the future in terms of our projects. So a few years ago now, and with the help of several awesome master students, of which I can see one in the audience, we conducted a survey looking at early intervention for children on the autism spectrum in New Zealand. So we sent it out online, and we had 63 usable responses, all from parents or caregivers of children 6 years or under with a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. This number may seem quite low, but we do need to bear in mind that the average age of diagnosis for autism in New Zealand is 6.5. So we're really looking for that younger population, and to be honest, we're quite happy with 63. This survey was in 2 parts. The first part was looking at what services were available to whānau, and the second part was looking at what they wanted to have, the services that they desired. One of the most important and striking findings of this survey, and quite sobering really, was the fact that of the families who participated, 19% of them weren't receiving a single service for their child. That's 1/5 of families who participated not receiving a single service. This is, of course, concerning because these children have a diagnosis. And within our system, we really feel that the point of receiving a diagnosis is to receive those targeted supports as soon as possible. Of those families who were receiving services, on average, they were receiving 2 different types of service for their child. The most common of which were speech-language therapy and support from an educator. Both of these services make a lot of sense when it comes to thinking about children on the autism spectrum. As we know, and as Jeff has indicated, social communication is one of the key difficulties experienced by children on the spectrum. And difficulties with non-verbal communication such as gestures, waving hello, pointing to share interest can be one of the first key signs that a child will go on to receive this diagnosis. Coupled with this, we're all very aware that communication is so important. That is how we express our wants and needs and get through life. So it is very unsurprising, and previous research has also shown that communication is a huge priority for parents when looking for services. The second most common type of service, support from an educator, also makes a lot of sense. The majority of New Zealand children over the age of 3 are enrolled in some type of early childhood service. And so they're interacting often on a daily basis with educators and education support workers, which is the equivalent of a teacher aide, but for children who are not yet at school. So this seems, and parents are obviously picking up on this, to be one of the perfect places to be providing professional support and increasing those learning opportunities throughout the day. In terms of services that parents wanted their child to receive, on average, they wanted an additional 5 services. So on average, that's 2 services that they were getting, 5 services that they wanted, demand for 7 services in total. That may sound like a lot, but again, that really does fit with our picture of autism. Many children with autism have support needs across a range of developmental areas. For example, social skills, communication, gross and fine motor skills, imitation, you name it. In general, they'll be requiring support. So we wouldn't expect, therefore, all support needs to be met by a speech-language therapist in isolation. In terms of those services that they demanded but were not currently accessing, the 2 most common were behavioural support and music therapy. And again, this makes a lot of sense. So we know that on average, children with autism will show more challenging behaviours than the average child who does not have autism, and this is really tied in with their difficulties with communication. If you can imagine, if you find it difficult to speak, you don't speak, you're frequently misunderstood, it's very hard to get your needs and wants met, and you may find that challenging behaviours are an effective way of doing so. So what parents are saying here really is they would like some support with some difficult behaviours that their child may be showing. Quite interestingly, there was really high parental demand for music therapy. On average, music therapy is not funded by the government. We've got some exceptions. And so, for example, you cannot generally access a music therapist through the Ministry of Education. So if you're wanting music therapy, often you'll have to pay privately. Music therapy is kind of described as using music or the relationships that you develop through music to target skills. And what we know about music is that it's very motivating and interesting to all young children, and young children with autism are no exception. So we're just seeing here that real interest in providing services through music, which is not being met. We also remember that support from an educator and speech-language therapy were the most common services that parents were accessing. A really high proportion of parents who were not accessing that service also wanted it. So we can see total demand, either getting it or wanting it, for support from an educator and speech-language therapy is really, really high. We also ask parents, what are some of the barriers to accessing this service? So you've said you've wanted these services, why can't you access them? And one of the most common responses really related to either availability or even awareness that services exist. So it was very common across all services for families to simply say, I have never been offered this service, or I was not aware that this service existed for me to access. Something that we didn't examine in our data that I wish we had was regional differences, because, to be honest, in some regions, the family simply may not be able to access that service. That service may not be within their region. But in some cases, for example, services through an occupational therapist, we know that that should be offered through the Ministry of Education, and yet a large number of families were saying they would never offered it. And so this ties into research from Autism New Zealand looking at diagnosis and post-diagnostic support as well, which says that families often report that the support following diagnosis, so actually getting support for your child with autism once they're diagnosed, is the area of the diagnostic process with which they are least satisfied. They speak about the time following diagnosis being very confusing, the systems available to their child being very difficult to navigate, and for it being very fragmented. So we've really got this problem here of families simply not knowing what services should be available to them. Another really common response was that they were on the waiting list for services. So we know in New Zealand we often have some difficulties with waiting lists for publicly funded services. A recent Radio New Zealand story talked about how this was particularly a problem for young children, particularly a problem for children wanting speech and language services, and particularly a problem, unfortunately for us, within the Wellington region. And this is for accessing services through the Ministry of Education in particular. So what we're seeing anecdotally with our whānau is often they might be waiting 6 months to a year for services through public funding. The next thing is that some of our services, as I mentioned before, music therapy, for example, are not funded by the government. So some whānau were also saying, yes, we'd like to access this service, but we simply cannot pay for it. We also in the survey asked about the amount of hours per week of support that whānau were receiving. To give a bit of context to this, the New Zealand Autism Spectrum Disorder Guideline, which is a really internationally renowned guideline of best practice for individuals on the spectrum, for their whānau, and also for practitioners. It has some advice around the amount of hours of support you should be expecting to see for a child. So they're recommending that a young child should be appropriately engaged in goal-directed activities for 15 to 25 hours per week. That's not to say that a professional necessarily needs to work one-on-one with the child for that amount of time, but they need to be provided with sufficient professional support to be able to engage within this context. Parents and educators, for example, need to receive a sufficient level of training to allow this to happen. When we asked families how much they were receiving on average for their child, it was about 2 hours a week of professional support. And no matter how we really frame that, that doesn't seem to be sufficient for getting us up to that 15 to 20 hours a week that we are recommending in our own guidelines. When we asked them how many hours a week of support they would like to access, they asked for another 9. So in total, 11 hours of support across all professionals. This is really interesting. The amount of demand for parents, only 11 hours, is a lot lower than what we're seeing from research in terms of parental demand in other countries. And it may simply be we could hypothesise, because of that discrepancy, if you're only getting 2, it maybe seems like super outrageous to even imagine you could be getting 20, for example, although we would need to do more research into the reasons why. Okay. It's all a bit doom and gloom, isn't it? But soon we'll start looking up. So the next thing we asked was how the services were funded. So this is only looking at those whānau who were receiving services, and one thing that's reassuring is that the majority of them were receiving at least one service that was funded by the government. So there's at least one service that they did not have to pay for. Again, going more back into an area of concern, was that 40% of those families were paying privately for at least one service. So what this suggests here is that for whatever reason, parents were perceiving that their needs were not being met, 40% of parents, solely by government-funded services. And that could perhaps be because of some of those barriers we spoke about before. So the final thing that we asked about in our survey was how those services were delivered. And services were delivered in 3 key ways. The most common ways that services were currently being delivered was by advice to parents. So the professional comes in, the speech-language therapist, for example, and provides some advice to the parent of how to support their child's language development. The other most common way of the service being delivered was direct to the child. So the professional comes in and they work directly with the child, providing speech-language therapy directly one-on-one to that child, for example. And a large proportion of this direct would be because of educators and educational support workers who are generally working directly with that child. What we're seeing a little bit less currently is advice with modelling. So the professional comes in, they tell you what to do with the child, and they also show you directly what to do with the child. When we asked families how they would like services to be delivered, this is what we saw. So we can see, in terms of advice, the proportion of families who wanted services to be delivered by advice was very, very similar to the way it was currently being delivered. So we could say, or hypothesise there, that demand is being met. This is the area of significant discrepancy. So we can see a significant increase in demand for both advice with modelling and direct services to the child. That suggests to us that parents want professionals to interact more directly with their child. It's not that they don't want advice, it's that they would like this as well. We found an interesting relationship between the way in which services were delivered and the way that they were funded. So most government-funded services are delivered by advice to parents. And this aligns very much with the way that the Ministry of Education views services. They support the individuals, the parent, the teacher, within the child's environment to empower them to know how to support the child. And the rationale for this is very strong. If you give these tools to people, they can deliver the intervention for many more hours per day and can maintain the intervention if professional support is removed. We also found that if families were receiving at least one privately funded service, they were significantly more likely to also access one service that was delivered directly to their child. So what we could hypothesise here, although again more research is needed, is that perhaps some families are paying privately in order to access a service delivered directly to their child because that demand is not currently being met. So, to recap the survey, parents want more. They want more hours of intervention and they want access to a wider range of services and supports. There appears to be an unmet need for services to be delivered directly to the child, and it also appears that some whānau are paying their own money for services, so there's also some ways in which their perceived needs are not currently being met by government-funded services alone. Okay, so now we're on to the second half of our talk, focusing, as we all know, for the millionth time, on the Victoria University of Wellington Autism Clinic. We've also touched on what the clinic does, but I'll have a go doing it in different words. So our clinic aims to develop and evaluate best practice interventions for young children on the autism spectrum in New Zealand. So what we know in all areas of applied research, and including in applied research for children with autism, is that research often doesn't translate into practice. So we could have a whole body of research that suggests that this practice or this technique is really beneficial for this outcome or that outcome with it for a child with autism, but what we're not seeing is that technique or that practice being used within the community. There are several reasons for this. The first is because as academics, you always publish your journal articles on really high-profile peer-reviewed journals, and they can be in a format that's very inaccessible, both for parents and for practitioners. The second really big barrier is that often the training in these approaches is not available to the community. So even if you're a super well-informed parent or practitioner, you can't actually find anyone in New Zealand to teach you how to do this thing. So that's kind of what we aim to do within the Victoria University of Wellington Autism Clinic, is to be delivering those evidence-based services within the community. Excitingly, at the moment we're based within the Autism New Zealand Resource Centre in Petone. This is an Australasian first type of approach to delivering services, where a whole range of services from different organisations are all available in one place. Again, trying to kind of address that problem that families have of navigating a very, very complex service. So we provide a range of services. We're kind of trying to cover all our bases here, be helpful to everyone. So the first thing that we do is we coach parents. Again, for the reasons that I talked about before, parents of young children with autism spend the most time with them and will spend the most time with them throughout their lifetime. So we really want to be empowering them first and foremost to make positive changes for their child. For that same reason, and because of the parent demand for this, we do coach teachers to support children in the early childhood context. And finally, again, meeting that really high parental demand, we do have trained therapists who provide services directly to the children. And every year, we try and train more and more therapists to be able to do this. So then they can go out in the community and bridge that research to practice gap. Oh, yes, this is our team. What was I going to say about our team? We took this photo especially, so that was a fun time. But our team is made up of a range of professionals. So we've got PhD students, we've got a postdoctoral research fellow, we've got, who else have we got? We've got intern educational psychologists, intern music therapists. So we've got a whole range of people coming through our clinic and delivering services. The main type of therapy that we offer in our clinic for the moment, not forever necessarily, watch this space, but for the moment is called the Early Start Denver Model, or ESDM. So a few years back now, I was tasked for my PhD to identify an early intervention approach for children with autism that may be suited to a New Zealand context. And so that was a very big job, a lot of very promising interventions, but this was the one that I eventually settled on for several reasons. So the first is that it's suited to our population of interest. So it's suited to those young children. Jeff spoke about the importance of early intervention. So it's suited for children under the age of 5. And really importantly, we can deliver this therapy to children on the autism spectrum and those who are showing signs of autism. I mentioned before that the average age of diagnosis in New Zealand is 6.5. So we really, really don't want to be waiting for diagnosis in order to provide those supports, because then we're just missing that beautiful window of early intervention. The second really key benefit of this model is that you can target a whole range of areas of development. So remember, parents really have a desire to support their children in all areas of development. And with ESDM, again, we're supporting social skills, we're supporting language, we're supporting imitation, we're supporting that whole range of development, because we know children on the autism spectrum have needs in all those areas. Next, I say they're all really important, but I think this is also quite important too, is that it can be implemented in play and daily routines. And that is just so important for the population that we're working with. We know young children learn best through play. We also have a huge focus in New Zealand in our early childhood context in terms of learning through play, and so this is something that would fit right in. What's really cool about this model too is that it doesn't just have to be play, it can be any kind of routine that you have as a family. So at mealtime we can be working on something, or bath time, or out in the community, and that helps ease the burden on parents of trying to find those unique time set aside during the day, and also allows us to kind of expose the child to as many learning opportunities as possible. And finally, another really great thing about the ESDM is that it's flexible in its delivery. So we can be using it with all those people that we talked about. We can be teaching parents, we can be supporting teachers, and we can be delivering it ourselves as trained therapists. In this lecture, because otherwise I'd go on forever, we will not be talking about all of the techniques that we use within this model, but we do run workshops. So, if you're interested. So for the final section of this lecture, I'll be talking about the research that we've done looking at the Early Start Denver model in a New Zealand context. So as I've mentioned, we do research looking at coaching teachers to use the Early Start Denver model. This could be a whole talk in and of itself, and it's Jess who we just saw her specific area of research, so I'm not going to go into that today. If you are interested, get in touch with Jess specifically, or we do have some resources available, a webinar on the Education Hub. So some of the research that we've done has looked at coaching parents, as I've mentioned before, to support and use their techniques, these ESDM techniques, with their child on the autism spectrum or who is showing signs of autism. In total, we've done 2 original studies with 9 children. This may seem, and is, very few children, but the kind of research that we do is very, very resource intensive, so that's why. Looking at these 9 children and these 9 parents of these children, the results of this research suggest that most parents were able to learn to use the ESDM techniques, which is really exciting. That's what we want to see. We don't want the model to be so complicated that parents don't know how to do it. Very importantly here, though, not all parents learned how to use the techniques. So this suggests that our way of coaching was not suited to some parents. We also saw that parents found some techniques easier to use than others. So parents found it very easy to be silly, to be fun, to read their child and to give them nice natural rewards. They found it a bit harder to create lots and lots of opportunities for the child's goals and to follow through on those opportunities. In terms of outcomes for the children, once parents started using the techniques, we saw that most children became more engaged with them during play, so were more likely to participate in the same activity, to share eye contact and smiles and communicate. This is really, really exciting for us. However, we found that most children with their parents did not improve in their spoken language, so did not use more spoken language and did not imitate their parents more. So to summarise this research on parent coaching, I would call it mixed. We have some benefits for parents, some benefits for children, but we're not seeing those improvements across all areas. Next, we did 3 original studies looking at the therapist implementing the therapy directly with the children with autism. And what we found from these 3 studies is first that therapists almost always use the techniques accurately, more accurately than the parents. This is very unsurprising, in my opinion, because they've had really, really intensive training before the program even begins. They've gone through a really rigorous training program, they've practiced with several children, they have a master's degree in this area, and they have had all that time to dedicate and focus solely on using those techniques, which is just not a luxury that most parents have. What we also found, similar with the parent coaching research, was that the children became more engaged with the therapist once they started using the techniques, and most children showed improvements in spoken language or imitation. So if we were to summarise this, it's generally more on the positive rather than mixed side of things, but again, very small sample size. We also asked parents who had experienced both, so both parent coaching and direct therapy, to compare these two approaches. And generally, they said they liked both, which is similar to the results of the survey. Parents are saying they would like coaching and they would also like someone to come in and work directly with their child. When we forced them to choose, I was not there, so I don't know what the interviewer did, but 3 out of the 4 parents said if they could only have one option, they would choose the parent coaching. And they spoke about that idea of empowerment and just being able to maintain those changes in the long term. So one parent said, "We just have more hours to give to him." The one parent who said they would choose the direct therapy over the parent coaching spoke about the expertise of the therapist, which is something that I've talked about in that previous slide. Perhaps identifying that on average, the therapist was implementing those techniques with a greater degree of accuracy. So she said she knows more about it, the ESDM, than I do. Okay, so final slide. I guess this is the most exciting slide to me, is where are we going next within the clinic? So we've spoken a lot today about the idea of parent coaching and direct therapy and comparing both of them. And recently I was awarded a Health Research Council grant to conduct a randomised controlled trial looking at just this. So in this trial, those in the treatment group will receive 2 hours a week of direct therapy from a therapist and 1 hour a week of parent coaching over 6 months. And what's so cool about this is that 48 children will participate in this study. So we'll really be able to see, which we can't yet, does this combination of treatment approaches lead to meaningful benefits above and beyond treatment as usual? The second really cool thing that's happening in our clinic is we've got a PhD student, Lauren Van Noorden, there she is, looking at tailoring parent coaching to meet the parents' needs. So I mentioned before that not all parents learn to use the techniques within your standard parent coaching. So Lauren's going to be looking at what levels of intensity do parents need, and finally, how can we tailor the parent coaching to each individual parent. And a final really awesome area of research that we've got going on in the Autism Clinic at the moment is our postdoctoral research fellow, Jessica Tupo, is focusing solely on Māori-centred research. Yeah, so great. Jess, we do really try to recruit Māori whānau to participate in our research, because we know that often Māori are disadvantaged when it comes to accessing our services. So we have a high rate of Māori accessing our services, and they do say that they find it beneficial. But the problem is we are just bringing in this Western approach and plonking it onto whānau, regardless of their cultural background. And so although they find it beneficial, it may not be the most beneficial. And so what's really exciting about what Jess is doing is she's got a whole year to understand the support needs of Māori whānau right from the bottom, forget everything we know, understand their goals for their children on the spectrum with the aim of developing a program targeted specifically at this. So that's just 3 of our many areas of exciting research going on in our autism clinic. And I'd just like to thank everyone for taking the time this evening to come and listen to this talk.
Thank you, speakers. That was extremely interesting, and I've been waiting for about 8 months now to see how the 2 of them would manage this. If they were both going to stand up here and hand the mic to each other, and I thought that was a lovely balancing of history, research, and practical understanding. So well communicated. Thank you very much, both of you. Thank you. A personal reflection before we move on to other thoughts. I'm also intrigued to learn about this whole idea of doing an early intervention, because what I've learned as an educationalist is a lot of things are dependent on language. And what you've talked about here is how important it is to get to children early when they're still developing language. Some of the diagnostic tools wait until people have got language, and you're moving in these areas I've never explored before. I love it. I think it's very great. The other thing I reflect on for a lot of people in education's about processing information and being able to translate that information into knowledge and skills. And I'm left thinking to myself, I need to reevaluate what that means, because people learn differently, and the way they learn skills is not just about processing information. It's also about being able to experience again and again. And sometimes it's processing information from one person or parents or other people. So I thought you kind of expand my understanding of education, and I really like that. So thank you both very much. Before I open up for Q&A for Jeff and Hannah, I'd just like to make a few remarks. The Autism Clinic has received funding and philanthropic support from Autism Intervention Trust, the IHC Foundation, Autism New Zealand, and of course private philanthropy. Not only has this support enabled the clinic to be established and fit out, it also enables the employment of advanced training of its therapists. We saw some of those in your slides. And it also provides early childhood services such as Plunkett nurses and early childhood teachers. With this support, Hannah and her team at the Autism Clinic have been able to support 50 children and their families this year. That's a great number. And as well as providing workshops for over 100 parents and professionals. There's now a waiting list for ESDN and its services. In 2021, the clinic's goal, of course, is to scale up the services it offers, as well as, of course, continue paying for the rental, like we all do, of the clinic space and the continual paying of a training of staff. So, of course, if anybody is interested in supporting this work, please do get in touch with Hannah directly. She'd be happy to connect you with people, and we'll be around for refreshments, so you'll find Hannah and everybody here as well.